welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Entertainment Network. I am your host, Sarah. I am joined by my tiny little co-host who's feeling very needy today, so he's with me for at least part of this recording session. And I gotta disentangle him from my sleeve. I hope you're having a great day. Thank you for being here. If you haven't done so already, please do like, follow, and subscribe on whatever platform you're either watching or listening to this episode on. Also, if you want to support the podcast in another way, you can do so by going to gsmcpodcast.info. There you can leave a tip or a donation, a question or a comment, and I'm happy to engage with those questions and comments as soon as I get them the next episode. I'd love to answer any questions you have. And the tip or donation helps not only this podcast, but the network as a whole. All of your support is greatly appreciated, whatever support that form that support comes in. I say it every time, and I mean it every time. Very grateful for any kind of support that you give this podcast, this network, etc. Again, that link is gsmcpodcast.info. He won't be doing this for the entire episode, I promise. So how is your new year going? I know I did an episode over the weekend, so I've asked you how your new year is going. This is my first interview of the new year. I'm excited to have a returning guest back. Obviously, we have a new puppy, which is taking up a lot of time. So much energy. Fortunately, he plays, and then he crashes and he sleeps for a while. But we're working on potty training, which, like anything, it's a work in progress. Today, he's done really well. Yesterday, he did not do really well. I got a little frustrated with the potty training, but it's a work in progress. So he's cute. He's a lot of fun. He helped me take the Christmas tree down yesterday, and by helping, I mean he tried to eat the cardboard box. He attacked the broom as I was sweeping up needles. It's crazy how many needles fake Christmas trees drop. I feel like sometimes it's more than my real Christmas trees did, but that's neither here nor there. But he was a very good helper. I always say I'm gonna leave the lights up somehow after I take the Christmas tree down, because even though I live in a place that gets 300 days of sun a year, January always just feels blah to me. And after the tree goes to the tree, when I've gotten used to those lights, I keep telling myself that I'm going to leave the lights up, but I just haven't done it yet. I'll wrap my couch in them or something. I don't know. At any rate, I hope that your January is going well. I hope this week is going well so far. Let's talk about this week's author. I have returning author Jody Hobbs Hesler joining me. She was here before to talk about her collection of short stories. This time she is joining me to talk about her new novel. It is called Without You Here. Noreen, 27, is the same age as her beloved aunt when she died from suicide. When Noreen was little, she had a special connection to her aunt Nonie, her namesake and kindred spirit. They seem to understand each other in a way that no one else can, but what Noreen is too young to understand is that her aunt is spinning out of control, her grasp on reality slipping, her alcohol use accelerating, her personal life in shambles. Noreen's mom, Nonie's sister, tries to help, jobs, housing, counselors, but she's not getting better. The only thing Nonie can hold on to is her niece, who she loves more than anything in the world. But when Noreen is playing on a tire swing under Nonie's supervision, there's an accident, sending Noreen to the hospital and Nonie into a spiral from which she will not recover. From that day in 1980 to the last months of 1999, Noreen's life spirals around the axis of Nonie's suicide, tightening the past's pressure on the present. Now an adult, Noreen finds herself a young mother trapped in a marriage with a controlling, manipulative husband. Or is she? She is haunted by the memory of her aunt, and she's afraid her own grasp on reality is slipping away. Without You Here is about generational trauma, mental illness, sloppy family dynamics, dangerous marriages, and the beautiful redemptive nature of affection and love. In the end, Noreen is left to ask, will her life forever be defined by her aunt, and can she stop history from repeating itself? So that is the description of Without You Here. I apologize. I said it when I previewed at the end of last week's episode that there is a content warning, that we do talk about mental health and death by suicide in this conversation. I should have prefaced before reading the book description. I do apologize for that, but that as you heard from that description, is one of the main topics of this book and this story. But it really is about family, about generational cycles, about mental health, about how things in our childhood affect our presents and our futures, and how our families affect how we interact with each other and understand ourselves. So many of those layers are present in this book, and it was very, very well written. And Jody talks about just how complicated it was to create all of those layers and get the balance right and figure out what was, what should go where, etc. It is multiple timelines with different points of view, because you've got 1980, you've got 1999, you've got before Nonie's death, after Nonie's death. There's a lot of kind of jumping around, but it's done so in a way that really helps to create those layers and those levels. So let's go ahead and go to that conversation with Jody. Again, the book is called Without You Here. The author is Jody Hobbs Hesler. I'm going to go see what that little dude is doing while you listen to a conversation with Jody. Hi, Jody. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for coming back. You are my second person to come back for a second video interview. So we're starting to have repeat authors on for the video. So that is fun. And I'm excited to have you back. Looking forward to talking about your novel. But before we do that, if you could just, again, share a little bit about yourself so people who don't know you can get to know you. Maybe people can have a refresher.
Sure. I live in Charlottesville, Virginia. I've lived in Virginia my whole life, which I think is strange the older I get. I was an at-home parent with my kids who are now well into their, young adulthood. But as they grew, I kind of would recruit more and more of my time to spend on my writing. So my writing grew while they did. So I've been at it for longer than that, but I've been focusing in more and more as I've parented, and then luckily was able to continue to stay home. And I write fiction mostly, but I also write book reviews and author interviews and some local interest articles for a couple of different magazines around town. So I stay busy. I also teach at a local community writing center, which I teach on Zoom. So anybody's interested, take a look. So I teach on Writer House, and I also teach for this other virtual writing program called Story Jam out of Chicago. And I have a couple freelance students. I love to talk about writing. So
thank you. Always good to get that information out there so people can find you. Your books look like your books. Your earrings look like books. Am I correct? And is it your book?
They're my books. Yes. I'll see if I can hold them closer up. So a friend of mine, when my first book came out, had these made. Well, this is the second book. You can't really see that. I think it's not gonna focus very well, but it is literally the book cover made small.
Yes.
And then the other one is the other book made small. And so my youngest turned them into earrings, and a good friend of mine turned them into mini books. So that was really fun.
I love it. That's wonderful. And you should absolutely wear them too. So you just showed us the book cover. The book is called Without You Here. It's a novel. Can you give an overview of the story?
Sure. It's basically a family-centered story. Noreen and Nonie are the main characters, and Noreen is 8 years old when her aunt dies from suicide. You can't talk about the book without talking about suicide. It can be hard to talk about, so I like to let that be known from early on. But Nonie and Noreen have a lot of characteristics in common, physical as well as mannerism, as well as sort of world outlook. So after Nonie's death, the family really worries about Noreen, worries that she'll follow the same pattern, and there is some history of that in the family of another family member. And that's a really big burden for Noreen. It kind of feeds her self-doubt. So it also sort of sets her up for picking some wrong relationships along the way. But also having this really vibrant connection with this really dynamic aunt helped her find this sort of the center of her joy in her life. So her positive experiences also owe a lot to her connection to her aunt. So the story is really about how both of those things shape her future. And when she lands in a dangerous marriage, how both of those influences affect what she does from there.
Yeah. And it's got some hard topic. It's, as you mentioned, suicide, mental health issues, some things that people aren't always comfortable talking about. So what was your initial starting point for the book? Did you want to open up that conversation, or was there a particular character that inspired you?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because always inspiration is so many layered. One really obvious part of the inspiration, and really doesn't necessarily mean it's the largest part, but a dear friend of mine had struggles with some mental health issues, and when she was stuck in a dangerous marriage, she stayed there a lot longer than she could have, because she was worried that she would lose custody of her children based on her own mental health history. There's so much we do poorly in treating mental health, and I don't mean we, the United States, even though there's many arguments can be made about how our health system doesn't support mental health. But I think we're still also in an infancy of understanding how mental health works, and what best strategies actually help situations that are really complicated. So it broke my heart that this person was stuck with so little resources, that she felt that the best thing she could do was stay somewhere that was not great for her or her kids. And it resolved. She did get out. But part of the story that I wanted to tell kind of came from, I wanted the wholeness of the characters to be there. I wanted people to understand how love matters, that no matter how kind of broken we might feel, or how disordered our daily life might become because of these things we can't control, that still our existence, our positive contributions matter. And that's really a good bit of how the story grew. But there were, I had written a short story ages and ages and ages ago, that really was more or less the last scene of the book. I mean, definitely completely changed by adding everything else that came before it.
Right.
Probably not terribly recognizable to other people, but the idea of being haunted by a loss that had both something to give and something to take, was in that original story. And that definitely made it to the final version. But there's so many things.
Something that Jody said about Noreen's character being affected by a loss that both gave and took something away, I think really is indicative of the complexities and the layers that I mentioned when I did the introduction for this episode. And a book with all of those layers obviously has a lot of different inspiration points and jumping off points. So you really understand a lot of the complexity there in what Jody was just saying. But we're going to talk more about that complexity and how some of those layers and levels affect Noreen as one of the main characters, because she and Nonie really do have the main points of view in this story. But we are going to take our first break of this episode. And when we come back, like I said, we'll be talking more about Noreen. You are tuned in to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my conversation with author Jody Hobbs Hesler. As we get started with segment 2, just your final reminder that if you want to support the podcast in a monetary fashion, you can do so by going to gsmcpodcast.info. You can also leave a question or a comment while you're there, and I'm happy to engage with those. Again, that is gsmcpodcast.info. You see it next to me in this video, but you'll also see it scrolling down below throughout the episode. So back to that episode. And before the break, Jody was talking about some of her jumping off points, her inspiration points for the novel, and we kind of stopped in the middle of that conversation, but she was about to talk about Noreen. So I just wanted to remind you of that context, some of the complexities and the layers for the jumping off and the inspiration for this book. Let's return to that conversation with Jody.
In one scene, Noreen is called into a teacher conference when she's in second grade because she's reading too much in class and it's keeping her from socializing.
Yeah.
I was reading too much in class and around the same time, and I got in trouble because when I wasn't allowed to read, eventually I tried other things I was also not allowed to do. And finally I started talking to people in class and got in trouble for that. And was I was being threatened with suspension as like a 7-year-old because I was bored.
Yeah.
And to me, there's like this injustice in it that really seemed to suit who Noreen was and sort of the other things that she's going through, this feeling outsider and not connecting the way the people around her might be connecting, sort of seemed to be something to draw on there. But there's tons of things, little sprinklings all the way through. Yeah.
You mentioned how we talk about mental health, how we understand mental health, and there's so much more that we can learn. I think we've come a long way, but we still have so far to go. And I think that's represented really well through the book and through the characters, because you've got different generations who approach their family members very differently. You've got, so do you want to talk a little bit about how you kind of present the different understandings through that family connection?
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the challenges that I had, and one of the reasons I set it in the time frame that I set it, was trying to get the idea of this historical knowledge and historical interaction with the particular mental health issues that are represented. So I set it in, the formative part for Nonie kind of is set in 1980, the summer of 1980. That was the year that panic disorder made it to the Psychiatric Diagnostic Statistic Manual, the DSM. Before that, it was kind of grouped under other just anxiety disorders. What I felt like was interesting about that is it kind of puts her getting a diagnosis that's brand new, while some of the treatments weren't brand new because it had been treated in other things. But the idea that we're in this sort of liminal period with understanding this illness, to try to put her in that moment, which increases the vulnerability that she's already experiencing. So the time period was really important for me for that reason. I drifted away from the generational differences of how people responded to the mental health story. So that in of itself, just how the diagnosis would be treated differently at different times, was an important part. And then we had this family history. So the mother/grandmother who had lost a brother to suicide as well, and her way of dealing with it was basically clamming up and pushing everyone away, and which resulted in, she had no patience for the problems that Nonie went through, because she saw her parents coddle, or what she thought of as coddling, her brother through his experience, and that didn't work. So she wasn't going to coddle because she didn't want the same thing to happen to her child. And unfortunately, coddling or not coddling didn't have a real effect on this illness. So the generational changes really just show just how out of control we feel when we are in a significant relationship with someone who has problems we can't help with. We can't always help. And I think that powerlessness compounded everything for the family and for the characters in the book.
Yeah. And it's a good time period because Nonie is seeing a therapist. She is on medication. And the therapist actually for that time period, it has some good helpful suggestions for her. But the medication is different at that point, and some of I know a lot of people, the side effects were so much worse than being on the medication, so people would stop taking it, which is the case with Nonie. I mean, so yeah, the time period really does matter, but you do jump back and forth to different points throughout the book. Before Nonie's death, after, current for Noreen, which is the end of 1999 or in 1999. Was that ever confusing, or did you kind of chart it out? How did you do that?
It's a really good question, because it was really the hardest thing for this book, was discovering the structure for it. The first draft was, a skeleton basically, but the first draft was in linear order. So we had things that were happening really in that summer of 1980, and then we sort of followed Noreen through life all the way toward the end of 1999, and it was it was imbalanced, the way the time went. It was really important to me to keep Nonie's character, to give Nonie equal billing with Noreen, so that they're both, it's almost like a diptych. Their stories kind of speak to each other throughout. Figuring out how to do that was really hard. But the interesting thing is the timelines were kind of represented already, because I was writing them sort of in order, right? So when I went to mix them up, the challenge was in figuring out how to juxtapose them. I had already created them sort of by default. I did add, and this story went through so many entire revisions before I discovered the right structure. So I had a lot to work with when I was splicing them together, but making that transition between, something that was more traditional and didn't work to something that was a little less traditional and did was hard. A couple of things that really helped. Jane Allison wrote a craft book called Meander, Spiral, Explode a few years ago, and it explores alternate plot structures away from like what we came to learn as the Freytag triangle, inciting incident, rising action, crisis, denouement. And she kind of looks to patterns in nature, the way a river meanders, the way a leaf spirals when it falls, that kind of thing. And I had already recognized that I needed to bust up the time structure, but reading that book sort of gave me license to do it, and kind of gave me some language around how to think about it. But also, I kind of came to that, oh, I need to do this out of order. And then my mind would blank. Like, how do I do that? I have no idea. So my kids, who had been huge fans of this book all along and been really patient and read a million different versions of it, they jumped to the helping mode, and the youngest took all the little index cards I'd been scribbling chapter descriptions onto from the beginning and input them into a big spreadsheet, and the other went through the spreadsheet and created a suggested series of juxtaposed sections. And I, like that, and I was like, well, it's possible. You sat down and I started working sort of from this list, and immediately started departing from it. It's completely different from what what she suggested, but it wouldn't have come as easily or as soon if it hadn't been for that. It might not have come. Like I might have just, my brain might have blown up, but it was and trying to figure out, like, if you don't follow chronology, what do you follow? And the idea that you try to balance the mood basically, and find, sometimes it was like an actual event that happened, in Nonie's period, and then is for some reason remembered in the current day for a specific reason. It comes back to light, and then you get both sides of how the event affected people. And sometimes it's Noreen's in the middle of doing something crazy, reckless. She has her reckless moments, and then we harken back to some reckless moments in Nonie's life, where you can see where the pressure comes from, why Noreen worries about things that, I mean, she's reckless, but she's not super dangerous most of the time. She's within reason of recklessness. she has an outsized sense of regret for some of those things because of this pressure that she's been carrying around. Trying to balance that was really hard too, because I wanted to make sure that the that the reader doesn't think I'm saying look how wild and crazy these people are. Like who would do that? It's not about judging their behaviors. It's about their judging of their own behaviors and why that happened and how they came upon their fears and their regrets. And that was a challenge and an interesting challenge to work with.
Yeah. I know I keep using the words complexity and layers, but that's what I think of when I think of this book, the layers and the complexity of the story. And I just think that Jody does such a wonderful job of presenting those layers and the complexity of mental health challenges and generational trauma and how that all affects everything. And Noreen specifically, of course, with those challenges because of her placement within the story. Obviously, Nonie faces those challenges as well, but Noreen is differently placed within the story, experiencing her own issues and experiencing her aunt's death, etc., experiencing her grandmother's response to a lot of things, and just, like I said, so many different layers and levels. But we're going to go ahead and take our next break of this podcast. When we come back, again, we'll be talking about Noreen specifically and some of her challenges, mental health challenges, and the complexities of the generational trauma, as I was just mentioning. You're tuned in to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my conversation with Jody Hobbs Hesler. Before the break, we were talking about writing characters with mental health issues, challenges, whatever word you want to put there, but writing whole characters again and again. As I was saying, things that Jody really does well is she writes these characters as whole people with joys and sorrows and happinesses, and yes, sometimes mental health issues or challenges or struggles, as many people have in their lives. And that's not the only thing that defines them. That's not the only thing that they deal with, but it affects so many parts of their lives. And again, I think Jody does a really good job of just presenting all of that in all of its infinite complexity. Let's go ahead and return to the conversation with Jody. It's a challenge that Noreen faces as a character because she does struggle with her own mental health issues, but it's a catch-22 because she does, we're not dismissing those mental health issues, but because of her family history, everyone interacts with her in light of their, the uncle, the aunt, the brother, the sister, however they're related. They have all this baggage. So they're interacting with Noreen, who's also approaching life with all of their expectations and all of her own expectations and memories. And then she was 8 when her aunt died, so her memories are interpreted through that lens.
Yeah.
There was a question in there somewhere, but it's just, I think the layers, and Noreen is much more complicated because of her family structure and history.
Yeah. And it's interesting because the only way I could get to all that, the only way I could figure out how to get to all that and make it pressing in the present moment was to keep circling the past back into it. So that it never stayed quiet, And I remember I worked I sent this manuscript to a writing conference that gave feedback on the whole manuscript and set up a whole bunch of other opportunities. It was a good conference. But one of the pieces of feedback that I got from the draft that I'd sent in was basically a sort of a generic, you can't have this inciting incident of the loss to suicide placed so far in time away from, the rest of the book or whatever. And basically the editor's suggestion was to push that event later in Noreen's life. And it kind of speaks to me to like why it's dangerous to have a prescriptive advice about a piece. It would be a different piece. So it would be a whole different story if
Yeah.
Noreen lost her aunt when she was old enough to process how complicated and fallible people are.
Yeah.
When you lose someone when you're young, it's a whole different thing. So it took me a long time to complete the cycle of understanding that, oh, that's true. These events need to be closer together, but not chronologically. They need
Yeah.
to be closer together textually, and that's a whole different thing. So it was really interesting because it was like both good advice and also like sent me down the wrong path for a little while. It was really interesting. So coming to that, yeah, it was coming to that and getting all those layers and making sure that I kept the tension alive was big challenges. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Obviously, we don't want to talk about the end of the book because we want people to read the book. But can you talk about choosing to end the book where you did, if that's possible?
I mean, I can also say without a spoiler that story that I mentioned, having written years ago, was basically that roundabout the ending. That there are things that I guess I can say that their child didn't exist in the original story, so there were different things happening. But essentially, that ending was with me from the beginning. Like, how do we get to this tense moment? And how do we pack it with the fraughtness that needs to be there for a crisis to be created, and for the reader to understand exactly what pressure that crisis puts on Noreen. Like, how do we do that? And that's kind of how the rest of the story sort of came into being. But to me, for some reason, that was always the ending. I think it is hard. I'm like very carefully choosing my words so I don't give it away.
I think we can say that the ending could be interpreted very openly. Like people can kind of, it's almost a choose your own adventure. What is going to happen to Noreen next?
Yes.
And that doesn't spoil anything, but so was it always that open, I guess? Did you want to leave it?
I think it was a little less open I think it was a little more clearly distraught, the original version. I don't want to say more than that.
Yeah.
But basically I wanted an ending that demonstrated, like I was talking about before, the fullness of the influences that this person and had left with Noreen, the person, Nonie, and the experience of the family and all these different layers. I wanted all of them to kind of bear on this final moment, rather than just one influence or another influence. And that trying to find that sort of kind of loading it that way was really important to me, like, because I feel like that does bring out the wholeness of these characters rather than make their struggles sort of a plot point or a prop along the way. It's really a fullness that I'm trying to explore.
When you were here last time, we talked about your book of short stories, and short stories are obviously very different from writing a novel, and you get more of, you don't always get closure for characters in short stories. So did that kind of influence how you ended this book?
That's a good question. I hadn't really thought about it that way. I think I like an ending in a story or a book that doesn't tie everything up. I think in a lot of like genre fiction, tying things up is the point, like when it's a mystery, the answer, and all the subplots of the mystery and in the detective, they get neatly tied up in time for, popcorn at the end, so like it's a more like predictable, but I don't mean that in a bad way. But it is in some ways a more predictable plot structure. The expectations of the reader are a little bit more streamlined and the same across that genre. Whereas in literary fiction, we don't set up the same question every time. So we don't set up there's less predictableness to the whole structure. And that's what I like. I get suspicious of a story where I need to know everything about how the character ends up, because that's not what I read for. I read to get them through this part and to kind of really go somewhere with them, not necessarily get somewhere. I think that's the difference, maybe a difference in literary fiction. I kind of think about it as like literary fiction, and this might have been somebody else's words too. I come to think of it, talking about this with another writer friend recently, but the idea that in a literary fiction story, it's the character driving the plot. And in a lot of other genres, it's the plot driving the character. All
Yeah,
of those elements matter. There's never, you need to have them all present. There's good writing in all of these genres, but the balance of elements is different. So the openness at the end, whether it's a short story or a novel, is kind of something I think is a little bit more typical of this genre of fiction than most.
sure. And we've talked a little bit about the timeline that Nonie's story culminates in 1980, and then this one right at the cusp of this millennia, which was a big turning point. What were obviously the 1980 with the diagnosis being added makes a lot of sense. I would assume 1999 was also a very deliberate choice on your part.
Yes. I mean, we talked a little bit before the podcast started about how, growing up before the year 2000, it was just sort of a common question. What do you think you'll be doing in the year 2000? And there's something that I do, like when I'm kind of like thinking of ways to enrich a story, or thinking of possible future ideas, is just thinking of big news stories that landed hard on me as a kid, kind of growing up. What are the things I remember, and trying to kind of dig into them. So the all of the sort of elements of what's important in those time periods kind of came from the experience, and then a lot of sort of research kind of rehashing through there. But yeah, placing it in 2000 was partly because of that. And it just felt like a great time to have a moment be forced upon you.
Yeah. And I think it intensifies Noreen's timeline as well, because it's pre-internet. Her mom calls her and asks her if she read something in the paper that day. Just it's
Right.
a different experience. She lives further out. They don't have a second car. There's just a lot of elements, and she wouldn't have had a cell phone. She wouldn't have had the internet. That's a different type of being a stay-at-home mom. Was a lot different when you didn't have those touch points.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, we were talking about the year. I mean, we were talking about the year 2000 and how it's now 25 years ago, and that's just, that doesn't seem plausible.
Implausible at all. We never thought, what are you going to be doing after that?
Yeah.
Which is interesting. And how many generations before us never had that kind of question? It would have been something else. And it's like, to me, that's fascinating. What are kids growing up now? What are they saying? They're not saying this. They're not saying, what are you going to be doing in the year 2050? That's not a thing.
Yeah, not that I hear. I just thought it was, like I told you, I thought it was cool because I was born in 1975, so that made me 25 in 2000, 50 in 2050, and 75 in 20 or 2050.
Right.
Yeah, and I just thought the math was really cool, and
Yeah.
now I'm like, that's still really cool, but dang, I did. It came a lot sooner than I was anticipating.
Exactly, like a blink.
Okay, so this is on topic, but still a tangent. I was weirdly not obsessed with numbers. I just had a weird relationship with numbers. I was much better. I mean, I got good grades in math, but I was better with reading, English, history. I was fine with math, but when I was little, I loved numbers. Like, I loved that 75 and 2000 and 2050 and all those, like, I'd be 25 and 2000, etc. Like I was just saying, I loved that our street address 103 was half of our post office box 206. Thought that was cool. Loved that my library card number was 248. If you double 2, you get 4. If you double 4, you get 8. I just liked that. And when I was little, I have no memory of this, but my grandfather thought it was hilarious. I would add numbers, and if they got too big, I would put them on my head. I have no memory of this, but I would put numbers on my head while I was adding them. Guess it was a placeholder. Anyway, that's the way that's a random insight into my brain and my childhood brain. Let's take a break. When we come back, Jody's going to be talking about what she's working on currently. You're tuned in to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back. Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my conversation with Jody Hobbs Hesler. Before the break, we were talking about the year 2000, expectations for the year 2000, how that plays a little bit into the plot of this book. Let's go ahead and return to the conversation with Jody. What are you working on currently?
Right now, I'm working on. Well, I'm always working on more than one thing. So I have, and since the novels or the books came out, I have an agent now, which is wonderful. So my agent has a manuscript for a novel and a manuscript for another story collection. The novel is almost done. The story collection probably has maybe one more story that that I need to do before it'll be ready to go. But I'm hoping they'll be like, we won't put them out at the same time. They'll be staged, but anyway. But the novel is called Watchdog, and the very nutshell of it, it's kind of about how as families we don't really know we misinterpret what's dangerous and how much power we have in protecting our families. So there's a teenage kid that's going through a tough time that the parents are not aware of. The mother senses it, but can't quite get through to what's happening, and the father thinks nothing's wrong. And the friction that they kind of run into over not seeing the same things turns into like a lot of drama between them that then throws all of the family attention away from what's actually happening with this kid, which we have her point of view a little bit and the mom's point of view as well. So we know what's happening and we know it's dangerous the whole time. So we know that none of the things that they're looking toward that might be the sources of danger are relevant. So so that's kind of where it is, sort of about danger and about our misinterpretations of it and how limited we are in being able to protect the people that we love.
And you anticipate both those coming out in 2025 at different times or next year?
What I hope will happen is that by some point in 2025, the novel will be being shopped to presses, and usually that means there's another couple of years before it would come out. And the hope would be that some lovely press would say, "Do you happen to have a second book at the same time?" And I would say, "Well, yes, I have this story collection," and then that would be the beautiful dream. So, but I think it's more like a 4 to 5 year arc of when they be coming out. So.
Well, you put that out there, and we're going to hope that that's what, that they say, "Hey, do you have something else?" And you'll say yes.
Exactly. Here it is, all ready for you.
Exactly, which would be perfect. What have you been reading?
Well, I have a couple of story collections that I really loved recently. One is called Sex Romp Gone Wrong by Julia Ridley Smith, and another is Sad Grown-Ups by Amy Stuber. Both of them are stories predominantly about women going through complicated things, different ages, and both women write with humor and absurdity and compassion. So they're really good books. And then there were a couple of novels that I really liked. This one is called The Orchard by Christina Newberry or Gorcheva Newberry. And that's like a coming of age story set in like Glasnost era Soviet Union. While like the old way is kind of ebbing, but the new way is completely unknown and kids are kind of trying to make their way in it. And then I really liked Jane Allison's Villa E, which was a historical novel that kind of was inspired by this real rivalry between a couple of architects in mid last century. And they had it was a woman and a man. And so there was a lot of like sexism that kind of went into her not getting her fair share of notoriety and him kind of just stealing it. So and kind of fighting against it because she was really doing some new things that kind of, I think, threatened him. So it was really, really clever, really well written and beautiful. So
thank you. So we are at the beginning of a new year. Are you the type of person that sets reading goals, or are you a mood reader, or how does that work for you?
I usually read a book a week, and I'm always trying to read a little bit more than a book a week. I feel like I should be reading lots more than that, but I read a lot because I'm writing. So, and I also read for the Los Angeles Review. I'm an assistant fiction editor there. So I'm reading a lot more than the books. But still, this year I fell short because I had, the two books come out back to back behind each other and other books that I was working on producing. And like, I felt terrible about it. So yeah, I hope I can get back to my, 52 books in a year. I try to read things that speak to me, and sometimes that's digging back in, like I love a lot of the 1950s, like women writers, also John Marquand was writing at the same time. I like writers that are kind of touching on these nuances in like socioeconomic, like it's just interesting to me how wealth and lack of wealth defines people's images.
Yeah.
So that can be like the difference between poverty and extreme wealth, which is, this crazy phenomenon that's getting worse and worse around our country right now. But it could also be in John Marquand's case, it's similar to like Jane Austen and Edith Wharton, where you're dealing with like the upper wealthy people, but the main characters are like the bottom rung of the top rung.
Right.
And it's interesting to me how similar the differences are between that tiny gap and the huge gap, and how much it defines the way people interact with each other. So stuff like that is really fascinating to me. But I also love the Southern writers, and I love to diversify. I love Southern writers because they're really deeply regional, but so are Caribbean writers, and so are like writers from India, writers from, all around the world. So like places that really writing that really embodies place is fascinating to me, no matter what the place is.
Yeah.
And I try to make sure I read writers who don't look like me, writers who are not defined the same way I am, identity, gender-wise, all of these things, because it's important to hear what all the voices have to say.
Yeah.
So all of those things inform what I read.
You obviously keep track somehow, since you didn't hit 52 last year, but what's your preferred method of keeping track of what you read?
A little obsessive. So I have a notebook that I write as soon as I've finished a book. I'll write the name of the book and the writer and what the date was, and I will give it. I will leave it's 0 to 3 stars.
Oh, okay.
So in 0, it doesn't even mean it was a terrible book, but 1 means I there was something I really liked about it. 2 means I really liked it, and 3 means it knocked me out of the park. So like sometimes there won't be a star next to something that it just didn't hit where I write from and where I read from. I really read and write toward human connection, and so many stories have it, but kind of feature other things more prominently, and they don't send me as much.
Sure. Do you ever pick up a book and think it looks really good and then you can't remember if you've read it? Because that happens to me. I have to keep track so I can go back and look.
Exactly. That's one of the reasons I started it. And also, like, people ask, oh, what's a good book I should read? And it's like, that question just erases my mind. I'm like, I've read a lot of books and I don't know. I have no idea a good one. There's not. So I have the list. I can just look at what the stars are, and immediately I remember why I liked it, what the book was. And I also write a little short journal entry about each one. So I can kind of like partly just remember, like, what was it about? Did I like it? So I can go back and double check, but also so I can kind of keep track of what interests me in the writing, like try to think of it as a writer, like think about why I'm interested in it.
Yeah. I was laughing recently because I get an email every day that talks about different audiobooks that are on sale through one place. I can't remember what platform it is. And so I always look through, and I was looking and I was like, oh, that looks interesting. Wait, did I read that? And I looked at my list and it was like 13 years ago that I read it.
Wow.
So, of course, yeah, I
still licensed to read it again,
Exactly. Yes.
Years.
Yeah. Because who knows what I actually remember about that book, but
right.
Anyway, if people want to know more about you and your books, website, and then any social media that you're currently active on.
Sure. My website is jodyhobbshesler.com. And I'm on Blue Sky, Instagram, and Facebook most. Instagram, it's Jody, Jody, _ as in WRITE, _ now. And on Blue Sky, it's just my name dot B Sky social, the tagline. But yeah, I was on Twitter and have found that most of the literary community has migrated to Blue Sky.
Blue Sky. So. Yeah, it seems like it. Whenever I type your name, I always, in my head, I think 2 B's, 1 S. Because I always want to put,
yes.
I always want to put 2 S's in your last name. And there is not.
I get that all the time. And I get an I or an IE instead of a Y for the Jody.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep. Go find Jody on social media. Follow her. She's delightful. If you didn't catch all of the names and the usernames, the spellings, etc., just go to her website. And most authors have their social media on their websites. It's pretty easy. I still ask them because I want to know what platforms you can find them on, but you can also just go to social media and do it that way. Last break of this episode. When we come back, just some wrapping up and final thoughts on Without You Here. You are tuned in to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back. Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my conversation with Jody Hobbs Hesler. Before the break, we were talking about social media and where you can find her. So go find her. But before you go find her, just listen to the last part of this episode and this interview. Jody, is there anything that we haven't covered that you wanted to make sure we highlighted, especially about Without You Here?
I guess I'd like to mention that the Flexible Press is a press out of Minneapolis, and they donate money to a cause of the author's choosing, like 10% of the proceeds for every book that they publish, and they choose things with some kind of social relevance. So the proceeds here go to, I'm going to forget what the acronym is for, but it's SPARC, and it's a local like suicide prevention group. And there are resources in the front pages if anyone needs them, because we address some very hard topics in the book. There's a hotline for anybody who may be feeling a suicidal direction, or people who've lost someone or are struggling with that kind of ideation in their family, and also domestic violence. There's resources for all of those things. There's also a Q&A in the back of the book that's set up for book clubs that can also be used in a mental health setting. That I feel like there's something that happens in fiction where we can see someone who's in a situation that either maybe we've been in it or we've known someone in it, and maybe we haven't had enough sympathy for ourselves in that situation or for that other person in that situation. We read about them in a book, read about something like that in a book, and it sort of triangulates our experience in a way and allows us to see things we couldn't see when we were experiencing, and it grows our compassion, and gives us language to articulate our feelings around different things. And so my hope is that would open some channels for people who've had difficult experiences. But even if you haven't had these experiences, you've had a sense of being outside of something, or being stuck on the outside of something, or feeling the pressure of a like a family stigma, or there's so much that's relatable beyond the specific here that I think people can grow from getting in the shoes of these characters, and really figuring out how they feel in those places. So that is also to say, anybody wants to discuss this book as a book club and they want me to zoom in, contact me through my website. I'd be delighted. So,
And actually, I'm glad you brought up the Q&A, because I meant to ask you, do you write those questions? Do you have help writing those questions? My mind would go completely blank in that situation. Write a list of questions. I'd be like, no.
Well, and it's a great question, because I had a lot of help. I have a writer friend who's a licensed clinical social worker who's had 20 plus years experience both teaching and giving therapy. So she read the book. She helped me generate the questions and helped kind of shape them so that they could be used for all these purposes, which also brings out how much research I did for this book. I'm dealing with a lot of mental health issues that are very specific, that are, I think we all have in our lives some connection to some kind of mental health issue, whether it's with ourselves or with a family member or with a close friend. We've all been in that world enough to kind of have some basic fluency in what it looks like and how it performs. But I didn't want any of that to be halfway done. So I interviewed a psychiatrist who specializes in anxiety disorders, and here at UVA, I read a lot of books. Some were sort of memoir centered and some were very academic. I watched a lot of documentaries. On YouTube was a great resource. The Australian government was a great resource. They have a lot of mental health, kind of PSA style documentaries, but they're 45 minutes long, really, really exploring something in depth. There were a lot of things like that. There are people I talked to just one-on-one who'd either experienced it or been therapist for issues that I was talking about. So I even talked to a physician about the arm break. Noreen broke her arm in a specific way, and I'm like, how would this have looked? What would the reactions of the people around her likely have been? So I got the details from the doctor, but also a family friend, the daughter of a family friend, had that kind of arm break. So I interviewed her, and I interviewed her mother, and what that was like and how it felt, and trying to understand as many things that could be specific, to try to make anything that could be
What are you working
specific
on
as
currently?
authentic and well researched as possible, so that when I wrote about it, I didn't have to explain it all. There'd be enough up here that when I wrote it down, it would target all the things that needed to nail it down for the reader. So
yeah. Well, thank you. I meant to ask you about research also. So we just got into a conversation, and I missed asking you things that I wanted to ask. So thank you for bringing those points up. I appreciate it. And thank you so much for taking time out of your weekend and kickstarting my 2025 with my first interview of the year. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and I'm just delighted to kick off the new year.
Thank you again to Jody for returning for her second conversation with me, this time to talk about the novel Without You Here. I very much enjoy when she comes on the podcast. I think she has great thoughts and ideas, and I like hearing how she puts those thoughts and ideas into her short stories and her novels, and really I just enjoy when she comes on, and enjoy speaking with her. So maybe you've read her collection of short stories and you want to check out this novel. You definitely should. If you are a fan of literary fiction, if you are you enjoy character-driven stories with generations and relationships and families and all of those things. Again, content warning, be careful. You know your own triggers and what might affect you, so just be aware of that before you pick up this book. But if this is a book that interests you, it is well worth the read. It is very well written. It is it's not always easy because it deals with some difficult topics, but definitely check this out. And there's like we were just talking about, there's the the questions at the end, if you want to include those in a book club, or if you want Jody to zoom in on a book club, I think that would be awesome to have the author just join. I love that authors are doing Zoom book clubs now. I think that would be very cool. But then, as you know, I'm a book nerd, so I would like it. I've never been in a book club. How crazy is that? Maybe that should be my resolution for 2025. Find a book club. Maybe. We'll see. Anyway, thank you so much to Jody for joining me. Thank you, as always, for joining me for this episode. And of course, I hope that you will join me for the next episode when I will be speaking with author David Ellis. We're talking about his book, The Best Lies. It's multiple points of view. It's crime fiction, but one of those points of view, kind of the main point of view, if you will, is a diagnosed pathological liar, but also seems to be the morally gray good guy in the story, I think. I'm working on reading it right now, and I will see how that changes, or if my opinion changes of the pathological liar and his role in the book. And David and I, of course, will talk about all of that when he is on the next episode. So please join me for that. In the meantime, as always, if you are a fan of this podcast, please do like, follow, subscribe on whatever platform you are either listening to or watching it on. Also, leaving a positive review really helps the podcast. It helps that algorithm, gets this podcast out to more readers. Thank you so much for all of your support. Another way you can support the podcast is social media. So if you want to follow the podcast, you can do so on Facebook, X, Instagram, Blue Sky, and TikTok currently. Thank you again for joining me. I hope you're having a great week. I hope whatever's going on in your week, you're finding plenty of time to get yourself lost in a good book. And I hope you'll join me next time. Thanks so much.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet, damn, ain't that great. I don't wanna go to